Okay, thank you. So before I turn this over to our moderator for tonight, I'm just going to talk a little bit about WDC. So next slide, please. So WDC, we've been around for 60 years, and we're a membership organization of politically active men and women. And next slide, please. So here's a little bit about WDC. We're a large group. We've been around for a long time, and we do speaker series, we do community education events, and like today, we do candidate forums, and a lot of advocacy. So this organization has, over the years, become increasingly active in terms of advocacy. So if it's something that we're doing that you want to jump in, we'd love to have you. And if there's something you're not seeing us do, please bring it to our attention. We'd like to work on it together. Next slide. So here's our hardworking committee chairs, and they drive everything that we do, and some of it is very high profile, like advocacy, or in some of these programs, and some of it's in the background, like Mary Lou, who's our treasurer, and Levante Gardner, who is actually today managing this Zoom for us. Communications, Lisa Fuller does an amazing job keeping us up on social media and keeping the newsletters running, and she has a really great team that supports her. And every one of these board members works hard to keep the work going for WDC. Next slide, please. This is our executive committee. We are a new executive committee. We came on board in June of this year, so we're excited to work towards what all of the different things we have planned in the future. Next slide, please. So here's a quick look at some of our recent speakers. As you can see, we had Lieutenant Governor Aruna Miller. We've had Congressman Jamie Raskin and many others that are coming to our events to speak to our membership. Next slide. So I just want to, before, obviously we get into this really important program, I just want to talk about some of the programs that we have coming up, events we have coming up for the fall. On October 8th, WDC is holding so this is a Mobilize Maryland event that you're at. We're talking about Latino voting trends, but the next one we're doing for Mobilize Maryland is a Get Out the Vote Dem Rally, and it's going to be in the Glen Echo Spanish Ballroom in the Glen Echo Park. It starts at 11. We'd like people to get there at 10:30, so you're all in place. And we have a really exciting lineup of speakers. Governor Moore is going to be our keynote speaker. We have Congressman Glenn Ivey. We have Delegate Jocelyn Pena-Melnick and others that are going to be a part of that rally. The rally is going to be followed by a canvas launch into Virginia, which is going to be led by Do the Most Good. And people can also decide to write postcards. So please consider it registering for both events. Do the Most Good has their event on their website. We have our event on our website, and we really want a good turnout for the governor. And we really want to see all of you there. So that's our October event. The second event we'll be hosting is with Jill Wine-Banks. She's one of the prosecutors during the Watergate scandal, and she was the first woman to serve as the U.S. General Counsel of the Army. So it's going to be an in-person event on October 19th at Imagination Stage, and Jill is a fantastic, phenomenal speaker, and she currently is the MSNBC legal analyst, and she appears regularly on prime time and daytime shows and hosts a really amazing podcast, which I highly recommend, Sisters-in-Law. And then finally, for the events I'm just going to talk about now, WDC is working with JPI and are sponsoring a community discussion for Montgomery County residents to introduce and report. It's on Maryland parole. The event takes place, it's an in-person event that takes place on Thursday, November 9th, from 6:30 to 8:30. So all the information is again on our websites. Getting back to today's program, next slide, please. Getting back to today's program, you can submit questions. We're asking you just to go to the bottom of your screen to the chat button. And there is one, if you scroll down, you'll see a question, a Q&A, like a title. So you can put questions in the chat there, and then we will hand them over to our Q&A person. Will make sure that we get them answered with the program. So before I get to hand over the program to the moderator, I would just like to acknowledge any elected officials that are present. And I'm just, hang on a second. Sorry, I have 2-3 windows open. So let's see who we have. Laura, do you have the list of elected officials that are present right now?
Sure. Let me just get
Sorry.
the list. Sorry.
This is my first time doing this, so I'm still getting the hang of it, and but we'll get better.
So we have Shanika Henson and Sarah Brand, David Naiman.
And we can,
and I think that's it for now.
Okay, and then we'll get back to this later. And thank you for all of you that have joined. So now to go back to the program that you came to see, before I hand it over, I want to introduce our moderator for tonight. Our moderator is going to be our very own Gloria Aparicio. Gloria Aparicio Blackwell serves as the first vice president of WDC and holds a role as co-chair of the Community Education Committee. She currently holds a position as founder and director at the Office of Community Engagement at the University of Maryland. Her remarkable achievements have garnered recognition, including prestigious awards such as the Daily Record's Top 100 Women, the University of Maryland Women of Influence Award, and the President's Medal, the highest accolade bestowed by the University of Maryland. So we're so glad you're with us, Gloria, and I will hand the program over to you.
Thank you, Madam President. This is great to be here. Welcome, bienvenidos. This is a great conversation and very appropriate to have as we embark in this new journey of getting mobilized Maryland, and particularly this community. These two individuals are the outstanding experts. So I'm excited. I'm humbled to be in your presence. I'm honored to be in your presence. So thank you for being here. I'm going to start with Rui. Rui, thank you. You're senior fellow, American Enterprise Institute, contributing columnist for the Washington Post, political editor to the Liberal Patriot blog on Substack, co-author of forthcoming book, Where Have All the Democrats Gone? Very important.
We're indeed.
Senior Fellow Center for American Progress from 2003 to 22, PhD and MS in University of Wisconsin. Great to have you here, Rui.
Yeah, well, thanks for having me.
The next one is Mark Hugo Lopez. Next slide, please. He's the Director of Race and Ethnicity Research, Pew Research Center, former Director of Global Migration and Demography, and of Hispanic Research, Pew Research Center, co-editor of Adjusting to a World in Motion, Trends in Global Migration and Migration Policy, co-author of The Future of the First Amendment, PhD in Princeton University. Mark, welcome. Nice to see you. He used to be part of the University of Maryland. Glad to see you doing all this remarkable work.
Thank you, Gloria. It's great to be here. Thank you for that wonderful introduction.
Yes. Now let's start the conversation as we see this going. Where are we going? I'm Latina, so I'm harder to get to know. We're not monolithic, so we have many different directions. And I want this audience to get a sense from you, Rui. Well, let's start with Rui and then with Mark, because Mark, you have done a lot of research on this, but also Rui, where are we going with this? What can you tell us?
Right. Well, that's a pretty big question. But I think something you said is very important, which is that the Latino population is hardly monolithic. It includes a lot of sub-ethnicities, many of whom are different experiences and backgrounds and attitudes than others. So even though we tend to look at it as a block for purposes of doing public opinion and voting analysis, once you look beneath the hood, as it were, we know Cuban Americans are very different from Puerto Ricans, are very different from Mexicans, and so on. So that's something to very much to keep in mind. I think in terms of something that's become recently salient politically, is that, as you noted, this population is a burgeoning population. It's really driving the growth of the non-white population in the United States, and will continue to do so indefinitely, I think. But contrary to a lot of people's expectations, the last few cycles have seen a trend of these voters overall moving toward the Republican Party and away from the Democrats. So that's really surprised a lot of people. That really came to people's attention forcibly in 2020 when Biden was running against Donald Trump for the Donald Trump's second attempt to get a second term. And after, you would think after one term of Donald Trump, Hispanics would have been voting much more heavily for the Democratic candidate. And it turned out not to be true. It's the reverse happened. Yeah, there was actually a very significant fall off in Hispanic support for the Democrats. It was about 16 or 18 margin points nationwide. It was bigger in Florida, it was bigger in Texas, but it really was all over the country. It was in, I don't think we have good data in Maryland, but we know in Philadelphia, New York, California. I mean, it varied in its magnitude, but it really was a remarkable shift. And I think we're still trying to process why that happened, because that was not expected. In 2022, Democrats more or less held the line in a lot of places, though they did not really gain much back relative to 2020. Now Florida, the floor fell in, but that was kind of a one-off a little bit in that election. But one interesting thing is, as we're moving toward 2024, and again, I think this is concerning to the Democratic Party and a little surprising, we're seeing not that the polling subsamples of Hispanics are not the greatest in the world, but it is quite striking how small the margins are for Biden against Trump in various horse race trial heats that have been run. I was just looking at the two most recent high quality public polls, and Biden is ahead of Trump in both polls among Hispanics, but by 6 points, which is like pretty bad. I mean, according to the best data from 2020, Biden carried Hispanics by 25 points. So I don't think it's going to wind up at 6 points, but it really is something to think about and worry about a little bit, that at this point, Hispanics just don't seem very happy with the Democrats. And oddly enough, when confronted with the possibility of another Trump term, a lot of them are opting for Donald Trump a lot more than you'd expect.
And that's the concerning aspect that we see. So I'm going to pause here to go to Mark, because he has done just a recent report that can also feed us a little bit more of the results that you have seen with these interviews that you have made, because this is critical. We need to find out why is that they're going into that direction.
Yeah, it's a really good question, and there's a lot here to talk about, because as Rui noted, the population is quite diverse, and I think people are realizing that in the last few years, that diversity can mean different points of view on some political issues, or even when it comes to voting and supporting candidates. But let me talk a little bit about a public opinion survey we did in the fall of 2022. This was a survey that asked Latinos about the political parties and their views of the parties. And for the most part, Latinos say that Democrats are more likely to be aligned with the interests of the community, the interests of Latino voters, more so than the Republican Party. But a significant share of Latinos also say, in a recent survey we just published, that there's frankly no difference between the parties. About a third of Latino registered voters say the two parties, they're about the same when it comes to how good they are for Latinos overall. And that's quite striking, because we hadn't quite seen that high of a share who had been saying that the two parties are essentially the same. So to some extent, there is some shifting happening here with even the ways in which Latinos see the Democratic Party as representing the values, fighting for the interests, and supporting Latino voters and Latino populations and communities around the country. The second thing I'd point to here is the growing size of Latino voters and the population of Latino voters. As you noted earlier, about 36 million Latinos are eligible to vote, and that's going to be the case for 2024, maybe 37 million. What's interesting here is that this number is growing and growing fast. And between presidential elections, we would expect to see an additional 4 million Latinos eligible to vote. I want to point out what we're talking about here and why this rapid growth at 4 million people every 4 years. That's mostly coming from US-born Latinos who come of age here in the United States. About 3/4 of that growth is coming just from young Latinos entering adulthood. That's important because that means that they're first-time voters. That means that they are people who are figuring out many things about their lives, including whether or not to register and where to go register and where to go vote. That's been a continuing challenge for Latino voters because some of our work looking back at 2022 and looking back at 2020 has shown that Latino voters are more likely to be among those who are non-voters. They're overrepresented among non-voters and underrepresented among voters, given their relative share of the eligible voter population. What's the other source of that 4 million? Well, about another 0.25% or so are coming, sorry, 25% are coming from people who naturalize. There are many Latinos who are in the country legally, who have green cards, who have been perhaps candidates for naturalization, but haven't done so because it's expensive, takes time, so many reasons. But you'll find that many Latino organizations are working to naturalize that pool of folks to then make them eligible to vote. So that's another source of growth in the Latino eligible voter population. Finally, there's usually a small number in the hundreds of thousands of people from Puerto Rico who move to the United States. Those people are eligible to vote once they have residency in the United States because they are US citizens at birth. So once they move someplace, they're eligible to vote in that place, wherever that might be. So those sources of growth, I think, are important to keep in mind. But this is a dynamic and a changing population, but one that's also seeing the Democratic Party still positively, but maybe not quite in the same way that it had just, say, 8 years ago or 10 years ago.
So how do we get them? Because you're mentioning that they are growing and they are getting into the political, but they don't, right now, we haven't attracted them to come to us. So A, how do we get them? And B, what are the issues that will resonate with them? Because clearly we're losing them for some aspect. What have you seen in the books, in the trends about this?
Rui?
Well, I mean, that's another pretty big question, exactly how you can bend the stick back in the other direction, particularly among younger Latinos who are coming into the electorate. I think one thing that's important to keep in mind here is we should overlay not just age or background, ethnic background on the Hispanic population, but also class, right? Non-college educated Hispanics, which is an overwhelming majority of this population, are pretty different than college educated Hispanics. They're much more culturally conservative, and they have actually been trending in a different way. If you look at where Democrats have been losing support among Hispanics, it's primarily among working class Hispanics, though there's been losses among college educated Hispanics as well. But that tells you something about how the Democratic Party is currently viewed as perhaps being too far to the left culturally. And importantly, if these are working class folks, I mean, what have the Democrats done for me? You know, maybe they're not that happy with how the Democrats have done things. We know, in fact, from looking at other polling data that Hispanics view, especially working class Hispanics, view the Trump economy more favorably than the Biden economy. In other words, if you ask them, you know, who did a better job in the economy, Trump when he was president or Biden, you know, since he's been in office, very strong position that Trump was better. And that was a lot because under the Trump economy, you know, people don't really parse like who really deserves credit. They just know stuff happened when someone was president. So stuff happened when Trump was president before the pandemic. That was very good for Hispanics. I mean, it actually, family income was up 10% or 12% over that period. You know, wages were going up, real wages. So it's been a bit of you know, sort of a mixed bag since Biden came to office. What with the inflation spike after he initially took office, it's now declined. But if you look at real wage trends and income trends since Biden took office, it's not that great, and it hasn't been that great for Hispanics. If you look at job ratings on things like the economy and particularly inflation among Hispanics for Biden, they're terrible. So I think what that suggests is you really need to lean in to this economic problem. You have to convince, you know, and I'm not a political consultant, nor do I play one on TV, you know, how to do this exactly, but you have to really get in the wheelhouse of these voters in terms of the things they want, in terms of their jobs, their upward mobility, sort of lower inflation. I mean, I know that's a hard thing to sell to people, but this is what they're interested in. They're interested in a better life. They're interested in upward mobility. They're interested in doing better than they have been doing. So it's not going to be enough probably just to talk about Bidenomics. It's probably not going to be enough to talk about, electric vehicle plants opening somewhere or battery plants. I mean, most people don't work in manufacturing. And that's really true of Hispanics, right? They're overwhelming in the service sector. So the target should be, how do I convince a working class Hispanic who's in the service sector that they should vote Democratic? What's the pitch? So I think I don't have the solution for that, but I do think that's the target.
To jump on some of Rui's comments here, I think it's important to note that we just had a report out from the Census Bureau about income, and household incomes for Latinos have been flat in recent years because of rising inflation, at least through 2022. And while there has been an improvement in the job market situation for Latinos, more recently, the unemployment rate for Latinos in recent months has started to rise again. So some very, very interesting points, I think, to keep that economic situation of Latinos in mind. It took Latinos, by the way, almost 10 years to recover from the Great Recession in terms of incomes, particularly US-born Latino-headed households. So COVID had a huge impact on Latinos and unemployment rates. However, during during 2020, we did see unemployment rate fall rather quickly, and it has continued to fall during the Biden years, now matching where we were beforehand. But one other thing that I would point to in all of this when it comes to Latinos and economics and Latinos and Latino households and how they view the Biden administration is that when we're talking about Latinos and their economics, there's a lot of aspiration to want to see their children do better. There's a lot that Latinos expect in terms of a better financial future in the next year and into the coming years. They tend to be more optimistic about financially where things will be compared to other groups of Americans. But I want to also say one last thing, which was a quote from something I saw in a news story a while ago. Somebody had talked to a working class, a Latino male, and he had said that, why would I want to vote for a party that tells me that highlights everything about being poor? What I want to really be is I want to be rich, and that's why I'm going to support Trump. And so that sentiment of how some working class Latinos feel, I think, is a really interesting story, given some of the policies that the Democratic Party has supported or is pushing compared to the Republican Party. So some interesting dynamics, I think, in terms of Latino public opinion and particularly their views of the current administration.
I'm so glad that you mentioned that, because I happen to be from Venezuela, and a lot of Venezuelans have moved to, have come to Florida. And the issue is socialism, and they are tying socialism with the Democrats. So what is the message then that because that's not basically what we're trying to raise here. That's what we are envisioning, to go in that direction. But how do we kind of tailor that message then?
Well, I think any.
Sorry, go ahead, Rui.
Oh yeah, okay. You want to jump in on this too? I mean, any Democratic politician who's like sentient and trying to win their race and has a significant Hispanic voter base should be very, very clear that they are not socialists. The Democrats are not a socialist party. We don't support socialism. I mean, I think that's just for openers. I mean, sort of it would be easier to make that case if there wasn't, in fact, a significant segment of the Democratic Party who are so much more comfortable with calling themselves socialists and have a different image of socialism, and even said stuff about Venezuela and Cuba and other places that is really not in the wheelhouse of a lot of Hispanic voters. So there's that, and I think that's a broader problem with the progressive left in the Democratic Party, that it has certain cultural views, it has attitudes towards socialism, it has a sort of whole world outlook that I think is pretty far from that of the median Hispanic voter, particularly the median working class Hispanic voter. And that's a problem because, to some extent, that wing of the Democratic Party brands the Democratic Party, right? It's part of how people see the Democratic Party. So that's not the greatest selling point for a lot of Hispanic voters. And sort of, there's no question. So the association with socialism is poison, and it hurt the Democrats in 2020 and probably continue to hurt them.
Yes, and so there are questions coming in, but I want to bring the aspect of language and also the label that that many people have kind of staying away from it. How do we call the Latinos now? Latinx, Latine. Let's give them something to the group here that are listening to us. It is kind of not big deal, but for some people it seems to be a big deal. So any response to that?
No, well, Mark has data.
Yeah, really, really good questions. I wanted to add a data point about socialism. In
Yeah.
the fall,
Okay.
we had asked Latinos about their views of socialism. More were negative about socialism than positive. So 53% had a negative view of socialism, 41% had a positive view. As you might guess, among Republican Latinos, 72% had a negative view of socialism, and older Latinos were more likely to have a negative view of socialism.
Yes.
So just-
Probably also varies by region of the country, if you had the
and it
data.
varies by region and origin groups too.
Exactly.
Yeah.
So what about language? What do we call this group? Well, let's first talk about what we call this group. And if you've noticed, both Rui and I noticed where you've been saying populations and group as opposed to the Latino vote and the group or the community. And I think that's actually really useful as a guide. Is when we talk about this is a diverse population with many different aspects to it. It's diverse along origin groups, around immigrant generation, around age groups, around region of the country. There's so many different ways we could think about the diversity of the population. It's unique compared to the US population overall. But what about these pan-ethnic labels? Hispanic, Latino, Latinx, and then there's a new one, Latine, which I wouldn't say it's new, actually been around for a little bit, but it's sort of gaining some traction now as an alternative to Latinx, it's a gender neutral approach. But we found that, first off, most people in this population are unaware of Latinx. 3/4 of the US Latino population have never heard of the term Latinx, according to our survey from 2019. Now, maybe that's changed since 2019, and we're going to go in the field to figure that out. But even if they have heard of it, very few people actually use it. What term is preferred? Hispanic, by far. In fact, it's quite interesting that Hispanics preferred 2 to 1 to Latino, so 63% versus 29%. And Latinx, so only about 3% of people actually prefer it to describe the population. How have congressional representatives actually navigated this? Because I think it's interesting to see what they do on Twitter and how they navigate this. And interestingly, our analysis of of tweets from congressional reps show that they've kind of, sometimes they'll tweet out a Hispanic, a finding or something that says Hispanic. Another one they'll do Latino, and sometimes they'll do Latinx. It's actually kind of equal in terms of the three. They use them at about the same rate, which I just think is a really interesting choice for a group that would be very sensitive to the choice of and trying to be sensitive to the public's choices for how they choose to describe themselves.
Didn't Raul Grijalva, if I'm probably not pronouncing his name right, the Arizona, didn't he basically tell his staff, I'll fire you if I ever hear you are using the term Latinx?
That's right.
I mean,
yes,
he was really, he thought it was just so out of the realm of the kind of voters that he was trying to reach and talk to, that it was a boutique term that really should not be used in normal political discourse. So that was,
and it generally gets used by people who are college educated, who are at universities, who are in media, who are celebrities, or who are corporate leaders. So it is something that's coming, it feels like, from the top down. And don't forget, Rui, that there's also what happened in Connecticut. Some Puerto Rican origin legislators in Connecticut have tried to get something passed to remove Latinx from all government documents.
That's right. I'd forgotten about that. Yeah, that's fascinating.
And then in Arkansas, it happened as well with Huckabee. Sarah Huckabee got it passed, and it's now, they don't use Latinx in public documents in Arkansas. And Marco Rubio and Ted Cruz have proposed something similar at the federal level. So there is a lot of pushback on this term Latinx. But I don't want to just make this about Latinx, because I think language is important too.
Yeah.
And when we talk about the nation's Latino population, about 3/4 of Latinos are Spanish speakers, but of course, many also are bilingual or are English dominant. So not everybody speaks Spanish, not everybody speaks English. So being sensitive to that is very important. And for Latinos, Spanish is an important identity marker. Many, even those who don't speak it, want to learn to speak the language or want their children to speak the language. But I will also say that Spanish can be divisive in some ways. And here's where I think you need to be careful to not come across as being patronizing. And that is that just to assume that, oh, somebody's Latino, they must speak Spanish. our most recent report we just published yesterday shows that 54% of Latinos who don't speak Spanish have been made to feel bad about it by other Latinos. And the commentary, if you were to follow it on Instagram for our where we've shared our results, or on news stories, it's interesting to see the divide on this, how people have been shamed for not speaking Spanish, but others say, oh, come on, get over it. So there's a lot of really interesting debate happening here, but I think it's a touch point that could be touchy for some people. So I'd encourage folks to not make assumptions just because somebody's Hispanic that they speak Spanish.
Yeah, and it also is to say, when you have a candidate that happened to be Hispanic, Latino, Latinx, and then they don't speak that language, is not Latino enough. So you get as not Latino enough. So that's something that we need to be combating as well. And I always said, it's not about the language, about the content. It's about what that person is going to do for us, moving us forward. So that should be the messaging. But in this case, then, what an elected official or a candidate that wants to talk to that community, is also good to start translating material and finding people to, getting in your team individuals that speak Spanish so that they can start talking to their communities as well. Is that a good practice, or what comes to mind?
Well, just like any good marketer would do, you'd want to understand the population that you're seeking to engage with. And here, I think understanding in Montgomery County, for example, the distribution of Spanish speaking within Montgomery County is going to be very important. And Montgomery County's Latinos do tend to be more likely to be bilingual or Spanish dominant than you would see for other parts of the country, because of the relative recent immigrant status of many of the families or heads of households in Montgomery County. But I do think it's important to try to be sensitive to this. It's also, the other thing I think it's always interesting is folks say, oh, to appeal to Latinos, let's have a taco party. But not everybody eats tacos. Tacos are not the cuisine of every origin group. And to be insensitive to that, I think could be something that could really turn people off. But it's a fine line to walk, Gloria, on Spanish. It's so interesting to see how many candidates have gotten caught up in this debate of, well, let's have mariachis at an event and let's start out by speaking Spanish. And that sometimes goes well, and sometimes it hasn't gone as well. And I haven't quite figured out where that tipping point is, to be honest.
Yeah. So going back again, so we have a diverse community, and we also have the LGBT community in our Latino, and that's what that gender, non-gender that we wanted to embrace. So how do we kind of address that too, and in terms of the political views?
It's an interesting question. In our same survey from last fall, we asked a lot about trans issues, accepting people who are trans. And Latinos have mixed views about this. This is where that social conservative component comes in. While Latinos have you seen a major change in their views about same-sex marriage? They're more likely to say same-sex marriage is they approve of it or it's okay. The views on trans issues are somewhat more mixed, and that's something where I think Latinos do distinguish themselves from other groups of Americans. They're less accepting of some trans issue, some of the issues we've been talking about trans acceptance in schools and even pronoun use. However, things can change, and they certainly can change. And it does seem that surveys of the Latino population show that the share of Latinos who are LGBT is higher than it is for other parts of the US population. And that to me, I think is really intriguing and really interesting. So I think there's a lot of opportunity here, but there's also potentially some challenges as well.
Wow.
Yeah, I mean, the polling I've seen, basically Hispanics are overwhelmingly negative on an issue like, for example, should biological men or boys be able to play in girls' teams, or biological men on women's teams. They're very negative about that. They're very hesitant about sort of some of the sort of medicalization of minors kind of issues that have become hot in a lot of places. They're definitely not enthusiastic about the idea that it should be easy, to sort of make a transition to be another, or like try to be another gender by virtue of medical care. They're very leery of that, very uncomfortable with that. I think the sort of the sweet spot here with sort of what the overall population or the subpopulation of Hispanics is, stick to civil rights stuff, anti-discrimination. That's something everybody's for. And as Mark is pointing out, the Hispanic population become quite accepting of gay marriage. And I think that the overall tendency is, live and let live. But there are certain lines that they're not comfortable crossing. And maybe it's best to stay away from that at the current time. At least that's my view.
And the other elephant in the room is religion.
Mm-hmm.
So the influence of the Catholic Church, the evangelicals, how do we see this playing in politics and playing for attracting more into different parties?
It's a great question. So some of the changes that are underway, by the way, because there's some pretty big changes on religious affiliation that are happening among U.S. Latinos. Fewer than half of Latino adults today self-identify or say that they're affiliated with the Catholic Church. 10 years ago, that was 2/3 who said that they were Catholic. What's changed? The share of Latinos who are unaffiliated with any religion. So 30% today of Latino adults say that they are unaffiliated with any religion, even though they may have grown up Catholic. They now say that they're not Catholic. That's a big change, and a lot of that change is coming from that population of U.S.-born young Latinos entering adulthood every year. Those are the folks who are really driving that change in terms of the unaffiliated share. 15% of Latino adults say they're evangelical, and that share has remained pretty constant over the last 10 years. But if the shares remain constant, but the population's gotten bigger, those numbers are rising. So there's a greater greater number of evangelical Latinos as well, and they tend to be more likely to vote. They're more engaged in civic discourse, and you'll also find that, for example, they tend to be much more conservative on issues and vote more likely to vote Republican than other groups of Latinos. So that group has not declined in share; it's grown in number, and it's one of the stronger voting groups among Latinos.
Yeah, it'd be interesting to know, Mark, the extent to which, with this rising population of unaffiliated Hispanics, what the trends are there. I mean, I haven't seen good data on that, whether they're part of what's driving this trend away from the Democrats. I don't know.
It's a good question. I also wonder to what extent the cultural markers of their Catholic upbringing might also still be playing a role in shaping their views, even though they tell us, I no longer affiliate with any religion. Right?
Anecdotally, I hear a lot that abortion is one of the key areas that they are feeling that alienates them to be more with the Democratic Party. So is that something that you have seen that getting to be the deal breaker?
I don't know about that, Mark. You'll probably have better data on this than I do, but I've always been somewhat surprised at the data I've gone over in the last year or two. Hispanics actually are not particularly conservative on basic abortion rights at this point that I can see. They're pretty similar to the rest of the population.
That's exactly right. That's what we see too, is that they're very similar to the rest of the population. They were behind in terms of some changes in points of view. Say 10 years ago, there was a gap. Latinos were more conservative, but that was 10, 15 years ago. Over this time period, we've seen a shift. The Latinos in many ways look like the general US public. And prior to the 2022 election, with everything that happened in 2022, the issue of abortion rose as an issue among Latinos heading into the 2022 election. It became, just like for the US public, one of the top issues that they were concerned about going into the election cycle.
Yeah. Another topic that I see that always they ask to Latinos is immigration, as that's a main concept, a main issue that we have in our mind. And the sad part is too that that's not the only thing that concerns us. Education, healthcare, and all of that is also part of that. So right. How do we handle that in that sense?
Well, certainly an immigration policy, depending on what we're talking about with regards to immigration policy. On the one hand, Latinos are supportive of a pathway to citizenship for undocumented immigrants. And they've long been strongly supportive of that, more so than even the general US public. But they also want border security. So you do see a mix of views among Latinos around different policy priorities regarding immigration policy. I've also been interested to see that in some of our surveys over the years, a significant share, like 40% of Latino adults, will say that the U.S. doesn't have an obligation to accept refugees from Central America or from other places where people are trying to escape violence or crime. That for when I share that result with folks, people are oftentimes surprised by that. But I think that among the U.S. Latino population, it's something we shouldn't forget, that about 15% of U.S. Latino adults in past surveys for us told us that they think undocumented immigrants should be deported.
Right.
Not
right.
everybody
Yeah.
holds the same point of view here with regards to what the right policy solutions are for immigration policy. All that aside, many analysts do talk about the importance of immigration perhaps being a way in which to reach Latinos because it resonates more with the Latino population than other groups. That may indeed be the case. They're more aware of it. They're more focused on it because somebody in their family is an immigrant. Somebody has gone through the process of getting citizenship, or somebody may be undocumented. Nonetheless, our surveys have shown this diversity of views among Latinos over the years, and that hasn't really changed.
Yeah, no, those are all very good points, Mark. I mean, I think it is. I mean, it's part of the key to understanding ways in which Democrats may have perhaps not completely understood this population, that they tended to typecast them as being immigration voters. I mean, that's their big thing, right? They want to support Democrats' more liberal immigration policies. And I think that really shortchanged a lot of the other things that Hispanics do vote on the basis of, and it also assumed that they were like very liberal on the immigration issue. And when you go away from things like a pathway to citizenship, that's not at all clear. I mean, they are for more border security. We saw that in the 2020 election and some of the analysis done in Texas, for example. I mean, they're really very sensitive to this. I mean, Hispanics who vote are citizens, you know, many of them got here legally, maybe some of them didn't, but they eventually became natural. So, I mean, they have a different way of looking at it than I think your typical Democratic immigration advocate does, who tends to assume that these voters are all, 100% for, the most liberal possible, immigration policy, and they're really not. And as Mark was pointing out, there's a non-trivial share is just, hey, these are documented people that just, send them back across the border. So it's complicated.
It's complicated. Yes.
I'm sorry.
Go ahead. Go ahead, Mark.
I was going to say it is complicated. I was going to share a comment that we had received in a focus group many years ago when I was in Florida doing some focus groups with Dominicans. We were talking about Trump's comments about Mexican immigrants at the time. This is in 2015. And if you remember, Trump had made some comments that say Mexican immigrants are criminals and so forth. And some of the focus group respondents were like, it's a really bad thing that he says about Mexicans, but I'm not Mexican. So I just found that was just such a striking point of view, and it's something that I think is echoed in our public opinion survey work. And to give you that number on deportations again, in our most recent survey, 17% of Latino adults told us that it's a very important goal for U.S. immigration policy to increase deportations of immigrants in the country illegally. So 17%, and that was in the fall of 2022.
Unfortunately, all of us, in some views of some people, we're all Mexican. So that's the situation. Now, it's 7:19. We have allowed a time for Q&A. Lavonte, I know that we have some questions. So if you can start for one of those questions.
Yes, absolutely. Thank you. I'll turn my camera on for this. I've been hidden for most of this time. The first question that we have is, what are 2 or 3 factors that are the most responsible for the recent shift to Republicans? If you could highlight that a little bit more, and particularly within the larger Hispanic community, are we seeing bigger shifts to Republicans in certain communities within the larger community? And is this really just boiled down to voters changing their registration to Republicans, or are they just voting this way?
Yeah. Well, one of the fundamental things that's driving it is, as the cultural issues that we mentioned a little bit in this discussion. Democrats have moved to the left very significantly in a lot of cultural issues, and that has not resonated with some Hispanics who had actually previously been voting Democratic. I mean, one of the most noticeable things about, if you break down Hispanics by ideology, liberal, moderate, conservative, there's a very large share that are conservative, and even larger share that's moderate. And the share that are liberal is actually quite small. So what's one way to think about the Hispanic population is they haven't been voting their ideology. A lot of conservative Hispanics, many more than should on the basis of ideology, were voting Democratic, and the Democratic margin among moderates is also much larger than you would guess, just the base effect on moderates. So part of what's happened is conservatives, especially, have started to vote in a sense their ideology. So they associate the Democrats more with a type of liberalism they don't support, and it was become harder for them to vote Democratic because previously they thought, well, the Democrats, they're the party that's on the side of Hispanics, so I'll vote for them. People in my community vote for them. My father voted for them, whatever. And I think that's become much more an open question for these voters all the way through, I think, significant shares of the moderate population. And then the thing we talked about earlier is very important in terms of economics. Democrats have assumed that they are totally, the party that's trusted and loved on economic issues by Hispanics. And that's just not true at this point. There's been a number of things that have happened in the last 10 years that have, so raised questions about that in their minds. So, one way I always put it is one way to think about the Hispanic population, at least very broadly, is they're patriotic, upward mobility, hardworking, working class voters who just want a better life. And when, in an uncomplicated way, they thought Democrats were mostly about that, it was easier for them to vote Democratic. The less they're convinced of that, and the more they think Democrats are like concentrating on other issues they could care less about, I think the harder it becomes for Democrats to make their case.
And I would add to an answer to this question is that the other part of the question was about how is this happening everywhere? This shift, this sort of a rightward shift of the Latino electorate. Yes, it does seem to be. The New York Times analysis that looked at precinct level data from the 2020 presidential election showed that, yeah, there was a big shift towards Trump in South Florida, but also in South Texas. Turns out also in places in Southern California, but also in Philadelphia and even in New York City. So while they weren't as pronounced, of course, in a place like New York City, still there was a detectable shift towards Trump in many different parts of the country in 2020 compared with 2016. Also, some folks, when they talk about some of these changes, they talk about some segments of the Hispanic population, like men. Hispanic men perhaps are more likely to be supporting Republicans rather than Democrats, even though, again, the majority of Latino male voters supported Biden in 2020. Also, when you take a look at other things like immigrant generation, third generation, particularly third generation Mexican Americans, may be perhaps more leaning Republican than other groups of Latinos, and then origin groups in South Florida, Venezuelans, but of course Cubans particularly have been identified as the groups that are also driving part of this. As I've liked to say over all of this shift towards the Republican Party and towards Trump over the last few years can't be explained alone by what's happening in South Florida. There's much more happening around the country with other segments of the population. It's not just a single story, it's actually a multitude of stories.
There's another question here about gun control and how important that is for the Hispanic community.
So in our most recent survey, Latinos do support greater greater control of gun ownership. 73% of Latinos told us that that's what they want, as opposed to protecting the rights of Americans to own guns. Latinos are less likely to have guns in their homes than other groups of Americans. And of course, some of the violence that happened in recent years was focused on Latinos in, say, El Paso, for example. We just had the anniversary of the shooting in El Paso recently as well. So there are some strong gun control points of view among Latinos, which in many ways reflects the general public on some issues.
Yeah, the question is, how salient is that going to be to the voting decisions of Hispanics? I mean, I think that's a little harder to parse out, and whether and to what extent it's more important than crime, which is like a terrible issue for the Democrats now, including among Hispanic voters. So, if you're looking at sort of violence writ large, gun violence in general and mass shootings, but then also like the very specific issue of, what about criminals and what they do in my community, it's not clear this nets out to the Democrats' favor at this point.
And the one that I just want to maybe touch a little bit, because this is a bigger issue, about the Supreme Court and affirmative action, how our community reacted to that.
I don't have any polling numbers on that. Do you, Rui?
Yeah, no, I have some polling numbers on that. I mean, we have data that shows that Hispanics basically, it depends on how the question's asked, but supported the Supreme Court decision, or basically opposed to the idea of race being a factor in college admissions. I mean, in the Black population, of course, is a much different point of view, but people have tended to assume that non-whites as a whole would have the same reaction to affirmative action. Just not true. Hispanics are much less enthusiastic and in fact unenthusiastic about using a race as a factor in determining sort of slots in various places like schools. They're more oriented again toward upward mobility. If you ask them, do you think racism is basically because, sort of due to individuals who are racist, or do you think racism is sort of baked into the structure of our society and institutions? Most Hispanics say it's a matter of individuals, not sort of what you might call structural racism. And again, that's different than some other more liberal constituencies of the Democrats. They tend to see racism as something that, of course, they detest, but primarily it does come from individuals, and they don't see themselves as being caught up in a society that's fundamentally and irredeemably racist, which again leads them in this direction with something like affirmative action of saying, well, okay, I mean, so long as it's fair, so long as I have a chance, so long as I can be judged on my merits, I'm cool with that. And they just don't interpret it in the way that some other democratic oriented populations do.
Excellent. So in 30 seconds, what would you recommend? What are your magic bullets here for this group to take away from this conversation? 30 seconds for each one of you.
Mark, you go first.
I don't know if I can answer this. This is a really tough question. We, in terms of the Pew Research Center, we don't make recommendations like this. No. But it is interesting to see folks talking about how to, what sort of messaging works with Latinos. And I'm hearing a lot of conversation about the importance of this messaging and reaching out early to Latinos. But I think it remains to be seen sort of what ultimately might happen with 2024. But it is interesting to hear folks talking about the timing and the quality of the messaging and who's the messenger more recently.
I would say don't assume this is a very liberal population that shares the views of a lot of activist Democrats and college-educated supporters of the party. They're pretty different. So, make your pitch to them where they are. Keep in mind, they're probably a lot more conservative than you are in many issues, and you should speak most of all to the things they're truly concerned about, and listen to try to figure out what those are, and then make your pitch on the basis of that. But there's a one-size-fits-all progressive Democratic pitch to Hispanic populations, I think, is a loser.
Wow. That's a great point. Oh, I would have loved to have another hour with you because there's so many questions, but this is what we have. I hope that you can come back, and we need to be discussing the census and redistricting because that's another big one. But in this, I wanted to thank you. Muchísimas gracias por being here with us today, with this amazing group here that stayed with us. And I'm going to pass this now to the Madam President, Tassin Asmat, to give a final conclusion to this event, but I'm in debt with all of you for this wonderful presentation.
Well, we're in debt to you. You did a great job moderating. Thanks.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Yes, you did. You did a great job, Gloria. Thank you. The questions were wonderful. And thank you for the audience also for adding the additional questions at the end. And Rui and Mark, this was really an amazing presentation, and it's such a critical and important discussion for us to be having. So thank you for taking the time. My only regret is we didn't have more people to come and listen to you. But what we do have, we will have it on our website and we will share it. The video is going to be available. And I'm encouraging everyone here listening to follow the work of both of these gentlemen. They're doing amazing work. And I think it's really an important thing that we should be really, really paying attention to. And we need to start engaging this population. And so there's a lot of work to be done. So with that, I'm just going to wrap up. I just want to remind everyone we have the Dem rally happening October 8th. go on our websites, please register, plan on being there. And part of this event, the work that we're doing with this rally is really, we're building a coalition of organizations. So the Latino Diversity Leadership Council, and then the Montgomery County Latino Club, Democratic Club, they're all going to be co-sponsoring, but we have a huge, sort of wide array of co-sponsors on this event. And so we're building this coalition of organizations and we're trying to work together. So hopefully that's going to help us inform us for future work that we're doing. Visit our website, womensdemocraticclub.org. And with that, thank you all again. Great program. And we look forward to seeing you in the future and doing something else similar for you. So thank you and good night.